So we're going to get started today with kind of a little bit more in-depth material study and really getting into how the materials work to the point where I hope today, by the end, you feel comfortable enough to make your own material like from scratch, like really make your own material. And the reason that I emphasize this is obviously you're doing a design and you want a particular material and you can't find that material. Well, you ought to be able to just make that material, because there's no reason you should be restricted into, picking from the group of materials that I handed you. But at the same time, if you understand the basics of how these materials work, it's really pretty limitless in the kinds of things that you can do. So we're going to talk today about three things. They're all called maps, but they're a little bit different. Transparency maps, bump maps, and displacement maps. And I'm going to walk you through using some of the existing materials to kind of explain what's going on with these a little bit. But then we'll also get through how to create these entirely from scratch. Let me open up here the my folder. Hold on. Sometimes. Okay, so just so that you guys can see what's going on, I'm going to toggle. I've already done these renderings so that I can open up the image and show you the end result. But I want to show you the Rhino file. This is not what you're creating today. This is just for explanation purposes. What I have here is I have different planes that are stacked up on top of each other such that I can apply and turn on materials in certain ways so you can see how pieces of the materials are working. When we look at a material itself, let me start with this shingle siding example. We have a variety of things that make up this material to begin with. So the topmost piece here, let's see if I can make this a little bit bigger. This is not my, I should open it in Photoshop because I can do that. Hold on a second here. All right. Now I can press Control-0 and get the top. So the topmost piece here is the photograph of the siding itself. So somebody went out, and you could do this with, say, the brick on the side of this wall. They took a picture of the brick, and they converted that into a tiling texture. So essentially that picture will repeat in both directions infinitely, which is the idea. So you don't see the seams. Now, if there's a distinct pattern, you'll start to see it the further away it is. Like if there's a particular knot in a piece of wood, that knot will appear over and over again. So sometimes it doesn't work as nicely as you'd like. But essentially, we have a photograph of the material, and that's flat. And from far away, doing a rendering, if we just put that photograph on the wall or whatever, it'll look pretty good. But if you start to get close to it at all, we need a little bit more actual relief to it. And so we could do that in two ways. We could make the surface of the wall have a scallop pattern to it. So obviously shingles, have this kind of a pattern to them. And so we could, plus they have some grain that's on the wood itself. So we could make in Rhino, we could make these triangles and then glue the triangles together, and we could render it. But it seems like an awful lot of work to go all the way around your building. So instead, we can actually do two different things to the material. We can apply a little bit of grain for the wood. That's called a bump map. And then we can apply a second one, which is called a displacement map. And if you look carefully at the edge here, see how it steps up and then goes down and steps up again? And once we sandwich the photograph with the wood grain and the steps up and step down, we get the end result down here that actually looks like it has some relief to it. And I apologize, the image is a little dark for you guys to see. Let me see real quick if I can lighten that up for you guys on the projector here. There you go. You can see it a little bit better now. See how it has the wood grain texture, but it also has the sloping pieces of the shingles. This looks far more real than just the photograph does at the top. And so we're going to do this today to create this kind of a material and certainly analyze other materials. Let me look here at, this is one that's a steel siding example. I need to open it in Photoshop here. Okay, here's another one. So in this case, we have like a corrugated sheet of steel, the ups and downs. You guys know what this is. You've seen it before, right? So if I photograph the flat example, okay, there's not much to it. I mean, obviously it has the texture, it has a little bit of shadow to it. It looks like that, but it doesn't really have any relief to it. The bump map, or the the texture, the fine texture of the steel itself, well, steel's pretty flat in this case, so there's not really much there. So we don't have much here. But then we get to the displacement map, this one, and this is where the corrugations need to happen. And when we combine all of those together, we get this end result at the bottom that looks an awful lot like real corrugated steel. So by carefully controlling this, we can end up creating this kind of a steel without having to actually make any of that. It's just the rendering process that does it. So another example here. Let me see this one here. Okay, here's another example. This time we don't actually have this is just like a metal mesh. We don't actually have any special texture or any displacement to it. It's just cutouts. And so essentially we'll use the third type of map, which is a transparency map, to say this area is transparent, this area is not transparent. So we're controlling which pieces are transparent. Let me open one more, and I'll show you that one. This one is like a kind of a wire mesh looking piece. And so in this context, we have a displacement map to give it a little bit of the rounded texture of the mesh, plus the transparency map that controls what parts are cut out. And finally, we get the end result that is the transparent mesh, but it has a little bit of an arc to it. Now, it is important, though, on this that the end result only sticks out one side. So the back side is still flat, because we can only make it go from 0 to 1. We can't make it curve on the bottom and on the top. So it depends on which side you're on. Most of the time, it won't make any difference for what you're trying to render. But I at least like to point that out in the beginning. So let's talk about how we do this in these various materials to begin with. And I have an example file that I'm going to use to do these renderings, which is on the course website, and you can download this as well. So if you go to today's lecture, or excuse me, today's exercise. Wrong one, sorry. There's this materials test.3dm file. That's the one that you want to download and open up. Essentially, all it is it's an infinite plane with a light and a sphere sitting on top of a box. So it's not particularly exciting, but it will give us good insight into how these materials really work. So now that I have these pieces set up, I'm going to go to my set view. This is my render materials test view, so that I have the same view as I'm working through this. And I'm going to go ahead and load up some materials. Let me purge all these materials for right now. And I'm going to start with the shingle siding. And I'm going to kind of work through what's happening in the shingle siding. If you don't have shingle siding, I forget whether I preloaded it for you. You'll need to load it. If that's the case, let me delete it and I'll load it again. Remove material. Okay, then I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to load material. I'm going to go into my flash drive. This is available, by the way, in the material pack that you downloaded already. So these ones are all ones that I'm using that you have access to. And I'll go into my resources. I'll go into V-Ray, and I'll go into V-Ray materials. And this is in siding, and it's under wood siding, and it's going to be the shingle siding. And I'll go ahead and I'll load that up. And if I click on it and I click preview, I should get the preview. It should look the way I want it to look, which is good. Hold on one second. And I will then take the box. Yeah, here's my material test layer. I'm just going to assign it to that layer. And I'll right click on the shingles and I'll say apply material to layer. And it's going to go on the materials test layer. And I'll say OK. Question? The V-Ray toolbar? It's under, so the V-Ray toolbar, if it didn't load for you, if you go to Tools, go to Toolbar Layout, and you can then go to File and then Open and go find that. It should be in your Downloads folder. OK, so I have that material applied. So let's look at the makeup of this material a little bit. We already talked about diffuse, which is essentially color or the photograph of the material itself. So right here under Color, notice there's a capital M with a button on the button. That capital M means that there has been a map applied. So you notice everything that I'm talking about right now today, transparency, map, bump, map, displacement, map, diffuse, map. So the capital M essentially means that there has been a map applied. So if I were to click on that M, it brings up a little texture editor dialog box. There's a link to a file. And so in this particular case, it's looking for the cedar shingle _diff.jpg, which, because I just loaded the material, shows up. It's the photograph. And I can show you that photograph in the file structure here. If I go into my V-Ray materials, this was under siding, wood, there's my shingle siding. OK, here we are. So there's the shingles.diff. This is essentially the photograph that tiles in both directions. That is the shingles. So that's loaded in as the color. So I'll go ahead and say, OK, that's loaded in as the map for the diffuse color, which is why it has _diff for diffuse. OK, so that's there. As I come down here, there's also a section called Maps that's loaded by default. And under Maps, there's two things checked. There's a bump map and there's a displacement map. The bump map is the small texture. It's the wood grain. And the displacement map is the large jumps, so the shingles themselves. So let's look at what each of those are. Again, same thing. Capital M means that there's been a map applied to it. So if I click on the bump map, it brings up that. Obviously, I have the file loaded. It is bump. If I were to preview it, it essentially looks like a black and white version, a high contrast black and white version of the same photograph. So it's just bringing out some of the grain that's in the photograph itself. The displacement, on the other hand, here is a little bit different. So let me click on the M for that, and I'll click on preview so that I can see it. What displacement does is it's a graphic representation of what I want the slopes to look like. So the white edges stick out from my base surface, and they stick out a particular value. And as the gradient goes from white to black, it slopes back to 0.0, which is the surface itself. So if I was looking at this whole thing in section, of course, right? Erasers are. I'll draw it over here. If I was looking at this whole thing in section, right, there's my surface at level 0. Something that was white, I would come up here a specific value, and we'll call that level 1. And as I go from, let me look at it this way, as I go from white to black, so there's black and there's white. As I go there, this is going to slope down back to 0.0. Does that make sense? Okay. The more times we do it today, it'll help clarify a little bit. So as I look at that shingle siding, the white edge, or the front edge, sticks out the most, and it slopes all the way back to black, way back in here. So they're actually nesting one under the other, which is how shingles do actually nest. So that's representing the big steps. Both of those are turned on. The value here under displacement is a value that is in your default units. So in the case of this class, I always said work in inches and make your default units in inches, because the materials are all set to be in inches. If you change to feet, right, it would be like taking this from a ½ an inch to 6 inches. So our steps would be giant, and it wouldn't look like shingles anymore. So I can do some examples. I'll turn off both the bump and the displacement. We will zoom in here on this edge, and I'll do a quick render. Oops. managed not to have the material applied correctly. There we go. Okay, so this is rendered out, and it's put that flat object on top of my image there. So it's just the photograph. If I go back into my materials and I turn on the bump map, I have this set right now at 0.5. This is some value. You could go up to 100, and it's going to put some wood grain into the texture. So I have it set at 0.5. Let's take a look at what it looks like. So you can already see, and I know the projector is not the best, but you can already see that there's a little bit of texture on those pieces. There's just a little bit that's on that. I could take that 0.5 seemed reasonable for what I was doing. If I took the material right here and I said, you know what, I want that to be 100, I'd get a lot more texture on it. We can render that, see if it becomes even more obvious. Yeah, you can see it a little bit more in the front, much deeper grooves. So this is more like a percentage value, how much you want applied, not an actual dimensional value. So let me go back to my materials. I'm going to change that back to 0.5. The materials that you download are already set for all of these values, so you don't have to go in and change them for the most part. Under displacement, however, if I turn that one on, right, this value is in inches. So I want a ½ inch butt to my shingle. And so I set that as a ½ inch. Now when I go ahead and I render, watch this back line there. Notice also that the render suddenly takes a lot longer because it has to calculate all those little steps. But see right there, which was a straight line, is now going to have the steps that represent the shingles. So you can see that pretty clearly on the edge there, that now we have the shingles. So this is a far more realistic texture than the first one that just had the image applied to it. And so it's about learning how to use these materials to your advantage to make that kind of stuff happen. OK, so I have that one done. Let me go ahead and change my material. Let me load in something different. Let me load that wire mesh. I'm not going to go through all the examples today, because I want to get to actually manufacturing some materials here. But let me see here. I think it's under metal and then screen. Metal screens. All right, so there's the yellow plastic. Let me apply the material to the layer. Material test. There we go. OK, so now if I go into my material editor, and I look at this yellow plastic coated material, we have some different options here. So first off, under diffuse, if I click on the map for the diffuse map, we have the diffuse color of the mesh, which is essentially the yellow mesh with a black background. So it's just the color version. Next to diffuse, we have transparency. We've worked with transparency before. Remember, we changed this value to gray, and it became a little bit transparent. We're doing the same thing using a map this time. And the map is controlling which parts are opaque and which parts are transparent. So in this case, the black parts are opaque, the white parts are transparent. It's entirely possible when I go to create these as an illustration for you later on, I'll reverse the black and the white. It makes no difference if you do it the wrong direction, because built into this dialog box, there's a checkbox for invert right there. I did build this one backwards. So you just need to check the invert box if you did it the wrong direction. So it's not something that you're likely to run into too much trouble, but it is there. So this controls what's see-through and what's solid. The reason I get this mixed up is Photoshop's backwards. It's the opposite, but whatever. Side note. So that controls the transparency. We still have the ability to control bump map and or displacement map. In this case, I did use a bump map, which is very similar, but it's a little bit more blurry. So we have a little bit of a rounded transition. Okay? So the combination of those three then make this material. So if I were to turn off the bump map and I were to delete the transparency map, the resulting material would be this solid piece. So I could do a quick rendering and you could see that. Not very exciting. I could go back into my materials here. I could turn on the bump map. And this is currently set to 1. And I could render again. Which gives us a little bit more rounding to it. It's subtle. It doesn't help that much. But the one that really helps is that transparency map. So I'll come back up to my diffuse drawer here, click on the M. See how it's a lowercase m because nothing's applied? It'll switch to an uppercase M. I'm going to put on a big Tex Bitmap, and it's going to be the transparency. And like I said, I believe I did this backwards, so I'm going to check the box for invert. Say OK. And now when I go to render it, it's going to take significantly longer because it has to calculate the light passing through the mesh in multiple layers. But you can already see that it's transparent. So it's through these objects that I create these materials. Now obviously there's other parts to the material. In this particular material, because it's kind of a yellow plastic, it has some reflection to it. So I need to adjust for that glossiness or that reflection. So depending on the material, you may have to do more. The cedar shingles probably don't have any gloss assigned to them, so that's not too big of a deal. So depending on what you're creating, if it's metal, it would have more gloss than if it didn't. So there's little bits that will have to be resolved as part of this process. So let's start thinking about how do we create a material from scratch. And I broke today's exercise down into 2 general parts, part 2A and part 2B. And this is essentially, if you've never taken 135 or are really uncomfortable in Photoshop, you can do it without using Photoshop, but you're more limited in what you can find. If you have taken 135, which by the way is most of you, you can create something entirely your own from scratch. And so we'll go through that process as well. I'm going to do both today for you. The first one, under part 2A, we're going to go to a website that has existing V-Ray materials. Now, V-Ray, I've told you before, works for Rhino, but it also works for 3D Studio Max. It works for SketchUp. It works for a variety of different applications. It would be convenient if V-Ray materials were uniform across all those applications. They're not. So we can go to a website like this, vraymaterials.co.uk, and they have a lot of V-Ray materials, but most of their V-Ray materials are meant for 3D Studio, not for Rhino. So in this context, we can go into their V-Ray materials, and obviously with a website like this, they're trying to make money, so some of the stuff they're trying to sell you versus have you get for free. We're going to be working on stuff that you can get for free. So for example, and I haven't actually done this, let me look for the white perforated leather, and let's take a look at that. I'll download that. Download now. I had to think about where the button was. There it is. Chances are it's going to come down as a zip file. So before we can do anything with it, we need to extract the zip file. So let me go ahead and extract all. And let's take a look at what they have. So in this context, they have a preview. They have this link. Then they have the white leather, and they have, I'm guessing this is maybe a bump map. Maybe it's a transparency map. Let me go ahead and double click on it to look. OK, so we have kind of a combination. The holes are black. Let's take a look here. OK, so this is kind of the inverse. So you're subject, whenever you're doing this, you're subject to whatever somebody else is giving you. Right? So in this case, these are the only 2 images I have. If I'm not going to do any work in Photoshop, I'm a little bit stuck. But let's combine these together nonetheless to see how we would make it. So I have those 2. I'm going to go ahead and copy these over into my flash drive. Actually, it doesn't really matter for right now because I'm going to pack the material long term, as long as they are, in fact, extracted out of the compressed folder. So we have to make sure we extract them first. Let me right-click and say Extract All. Oh, it looks like I already did. Sorry. There it is. Let me go back into V-Ray and Rhino. And I'm going to go into my materials. So I'll click on the M. And I'm going to create a brand new material. So I'll right-click on Scene Materials, Create Material, Standard. And this is going to be white leather. I'll go ahead and say OK. So the first thing that I have is I have a diffuse color that I need to load. So it's not gray. It's going to be a map, because I have that map. So I'll click on the M. And to specify the photograph, I'm going to go to, this is going to be a bitmap. It's called the Tex Bitmap right there. And then I have to go find it. So this was in my downloads folder. If I can find it, downloads, there we go. There's my perforated leather. There it is in white. I'll go ahead and say open. If I preview it, I should get my leather. I'll say OK. So that then gives me, if I were to render this, let me apply it to layer. If I were to render it, it would give me a white leather looking material. But this is, again, just based on the photograph of the material, nothing more than that. So there it is. If I wanted to add a bump map, I go into my material, V-Ray material editor here, and I would come down under maps. I can choose bump map. I'll check the little box next to it. I have to actually assign the map, so I'll click on the M. And I'll go find a Tex Bitmap that is the bump map that they created for me, right there. That's loaded. I'll go ahead and say OK. So the bump map is there. I don't know just yet what the value should be. We'll start at 1 and see. If it needs more, I'll add more to it. So now that I have that, I'll go ahead and render again. And you can already tell when you first start the render that it looks different. The colors look different and whatever. And so now it does have a little bit more texture to it. And so that might be OK long term. So in this case, I've been able to assemble this from the diffuse picture and the bump map picture that they gave me. So once I'm done with this, I'm going to zoom back out. I'll go to set camera, set view, the render materials test. I'll go ahead and I'll render this so I get a nice preview that shows the whole leather object here. And somehow this is bugging me. This material texture mapping went bad. How about 48? Nice. Oh, there it is. Sorry. No, that's not going to work. There we go. That's what I wanted. Let's do 1 point. All right, we'll leave it like that. OK, let me render it one more time. Sorry. It was bugging me that it was the 4. All right, so I have the white leather. I'm going to save this as my white leather material. So let me go ahead and create a new folder for this. So I'll go to New and then Folder. We'll call this White Leather. I'll double click on it. Oops, wrong one. And so this is White Leather Sample. I'll click Save. Then I need to actually pack the material, so I collect everything into one place. So I'll go into my materials. I'll go to white leather. There it is. I'll right-click on it and say Pack Material. And what packing the material does is it goes and gets those files that I linked. Remember those two white leather? It'll go get them, they're in the downloads folder right now. It'll bring them together into a single zip file for me, so I won't lose those pieces. And we'll go ahead and put those into today's folder as well. There's my white leather. There it is. I'll click Save. And it then creates a zip file for me in that white leather folder. So there's that. There's that. I would need to extract the zip file here. And when I do that, it's going to give me the white leather Vismat, which is what allows us to reload the material into a different document. And it, again, collects those two files for me that make up the leather. So I did that once, and I've gone through that process. You can do the same thing with an additional set of materials from this website or from any website. And you can spend some time actually going and looking for it. Remember, I'm not asking you to actually buy anything. You can just browse and find something. There's a variety of different ones out there. Stay away from things like glass because they're not photograph based. They're set up with reflections and whatever. They're not going to give you too much. Let's see what's under organic. It sounds kind of interesting. The tree bark V-Ray material. That could be interesting. Let's download that one. All right, so there it is. Let me extract all. OK, so here, this one's pretty clearly labeled. We have a bark bump and we have a bark diffuse. So we can work with those two to create a tree bark material. Same process. I'm repeating myself here. We go back into my material editor. I'll right-click on Seam Materials. Maybe not. V-Ray did a great job of crashing on me. Gotta love it. When that happens, we close Rhino. We open it back up again. Go back to my materials. I'm going to right-click and say Create Material. This is going to be a standard material. We'll rename it to be Tree Bark. I'm going to first assign the diffuse map. So I'll click on the lowercase m here under diffuse. And we're going to choose Tex Bitmap. And I'll go find, this was under my downloads folder again. I'll find my bark. And if we click on preview, we'll see the texture of the bark. Go ahead and say OK. Remember, that's the color photograph. There it is. Then I can get to transparency, but there isn't any transparency. The tree's not transparent. We'll come down here and we'll turn on bump map. We'll click on the M, and we'll go ahead and we'll load up the Tex Bitmap for the bump map. And I'll say OK. Now if we were to preview it, we should get a little bit more relief. It's entirely possible, though, that instead of applying it as a bump, we might rather apply it as a displacement map, because that gives us a little bit more depth to it. And again, I didn't create it, so I don't know their strategy here. But if I click on the M and I load up that same bump map as a texture, as a displacement map, and I think about what's the biggest distance between in this surface that I want to have. Maybe the bark has maybe an inch groove to it, so we'll do it at 1, or maybe 0.75. Try that. We can give it a preview. See what it looks like. OK, we'll leave it like that. Let me apply that material to layer. It's going to go on the materials test layer. There it is. Let's zoom in a little bit to take a closer look at this. And we'll go ahead and we'll render it, because I'm trying to get a sense for, did I do it the right amount, or too much, or too little, etc. I think one of the problems in this is going to be that the map here, we have nice true black that's deep in the grooves, but we don't really have a true white. So we should do a levels adjustment on this in Photoshop and get a true white and a true black, and then we'll have a much better displacement because it'll pop up a little bit more. So in the interest of showing you this, we'll let this finish up. But in reality, we would probably do a little bit better job between the white and the black. So if you want to create one entirely from yourself, so I'm moving on to part 2b. If you wanted to create one entirely for yourself, it gets a little bit more complicated because we have to find an image and then we have to make it work in Photoshop. We'll create all these pieces. It looks like as this is starting to render out, it's squished funny because of the way the texture was created. I need to make some modifications to that in the mapping to make that look a little bit better. So let me go ahead and close that for now. It didn't really turn out the way I wanted, so we'll move on. And this time I want to go find some kind of a material. So maybe I want, I've done lots of wood siding before. I'm trying to think of something that's different. Stone, let's do ashlar. Let's see what comes up. Let me try ashlar wall. Again, it's always about what's your search term and what are you going to be able to find in that search term. Texture. Okay, let's take a look at this one. This isn't bad. The problem is all of these streaks are going to be repetitive the more times I use it. So I don't really like that. Try stone wall. Okay, this is a little bit better. Stone wall. All right, let's do this one. Kind of the split face granite, for example. So I'm going to go ahead, assuming that the size is big enough. No, the size isn't big enough. Let me minimum size large this time. And again, a lot of this is always about picking the right, original image to work from. Sorry, bear with me a little bit. The more selective you are in this process, the better your end result is going to be. Something like that. It's pretty good. So let's see what sizes are. Okay, it's a decent original size, so I'm going to go ahead and download the original size. The little downward pointing arrow here allows us to download the original size. There it is. I'm going to go ahead and show it in a folder here. It's named that. I'm going to open that file in Photoshop. So let me go ahead and open with Adobe Photoshop. There it is. So this is the file that I'm going to work with. But before I start to really work with it, I need to make sure that it tiles in all directions. So this, you did actually, I think, some of you did this in 135, where you had to do this tiling texture thing. Some of you might not have done it. So there is a tutorial that's written up in how to do it. It's under Photoshop. And let me try to remember here. Tiling texture 1.22. Notice there is also displacement map, bump map, and transparency map. So they're all there written out for you in case you want to go back and review any of the things that I'm talking through. So here we are. Here's my stone. This is what I want to try to create into a tiling texture. So the first thing that I need to kind of work through is notice that all of these lines are a little bit on an angle. Well, they're never going to tile correctly together if they're all on an angle. I can double check that by pulling a little guide down here and taking a look at one row. So here it is, and as I go across, it's almost one whole course off to one side. So we need to make that correction. And I can do that in a variety of ways. I could go into Edit. Sorry, this is still a locked background. I need to right-click to say Layer from Background, which gives me something to work with. Then I can go into edit. I could go to free transform, and we could rotate this over just a little bit like that. So now that going across there is pretty good. We may find that we need a few more guides. Guides never hurt anybody, so it's easy to go ahead and do that. Now notice right here it's pretty even on that course. If I look at this course though, it starts to kind of get off there a little bit towards the end. Let me do one down here at the bottom too to double check. Okay, so we're coming along on that course and then suddenly that's off. So instead of just like saying, oh, it's good enough, I really want to take some time and work through this. So I'll commit to the rotation, but then I'm going to go in and I'm going to go to my skew. So I'll go to transform and then skew. And that's going to allow me to stretch parts of this image down so that that line lines up all the way across there. Let me work with this one up here just a little bit. That's now horizontal. Sometimes you need more lines that go across so you can keep double checking where you are. Maybe it needs a little bit more like that. Essentially what I'm doing is I'm correcting for the distortion of the photograph itself so that the lines don't curve. Once I feel satisfied with that, I'll go ahead and commit to it and say, yes, that's good. It's now straight kind of the way I want it. And now I need to go and kind of crop it down a little bit. And this is where, when I start to do the crop, I'm looking for things that are going to repeat, things that are going to be out of place, things that aren't going to feel right. So we'll go ahead and go into the crop tool. We'll shrink this down just a little bit. I usually crop it at least a little bit. But as I do it, I want to pay attention. So right here, if I crop it halfway through this rock, I'm going to have to match it up to a rock that's down here somehow. So maybe if I drag something over and kind of say, OK, there's a rock. What's going on down here? Well, that's pretty close to that rock. That's not too bad. But it might not be as good over here somewhere where I have the end of a rock. Yeah, it's halfway through another rock. So we're going to have issues when I go to do this. But that's the nature of trying to do it with this wall to begin with. So let me shrink this one down just a little bit. If something was a little blurry or that blue rock there is kind of a repeating pattern, I'm not a huge fan of that. Let's shrink this down just a little bit more because we're getting a little bit of perspective issue there. Yeah, maybe something like that. It might also be easier to make the seam on the black instead of making it halfway through a rock. So maybe I'll try to make it line up on the halfway point there. Something like that. So once I have this set up the way I want, I'll go ahead and commit to it, and I'll say OK. And now I have an image that's starting to get close to being able to be tiled. But I want to make sure that it's a tiling image, and I'll do that using something called the offset filter. But before I do the offset filter, I really need to know kind of the general size of my image. So let me just go to image size and say, OK, it's about 1700 by about 1000. And when I go to filter, other, offset, I'm going to try to set this for about half the value. So we had it at 1700, so that would be about, we'll call it 850. And this was about 1000, so we'll do it about 500. And when I do that, we can see the seam appearing right there. And there should be another seam right across the center right there. Now notice the seam across the center worked out pretty well because I lined it up with where the grooves are. So it almost works without too much added stress. But the side here is definitely going to take a little bit of work to make those line up. So let me go ahead and commit to it. I'll say OK. Now I need to zoom in and make some adjustments with my clone stamp tool. So I'll go into clone stamp. I don't need my grass brush. Probably need a reasonably hard brush. And we'll start with that size. And I'm going to copy from one area over to another area. So for example, let's see, this edge looks pretty good. Maybe I can use that right there. I'll hold down Alt to copy from right there. We'll move it up to the edge here, and we'll kind of copy that across to there. Maybe I need a little bit fuzzier so that they blur together. And of course, I'm doing the hard one here. It's a little bit harder to do. Let's take this. And we'll start to seam that together. About like that. Copy that over into that rock there. Those two seams don't match, so let's take this seam and see if we can create a seam right there. You guys get the idea. So I have to tie these two pieces together so they start to feel like they belong as one seamed drawing. Unfortunately, I picked one that was really challenging, so this would take me a while to do it well. But I'll do a little bit more on it really quick. Hopefully you guys can bear with me just a little bit longer. We'll try to transition that together a little bit better. Oops. Helps if you hold down the correct key. There we go. Make that transition. So there's the horizontal seam. I said that already worked pretty well together. Let's do a little bit of touch up on that. And you guys get the idea. So obviously, in my case, this isn't going to be perfect because I don't want you to sit here for a half hour while I work through it. But once you work through the seams, then this becomes a tiling texture that goes in all directions. So I'll go ahead and I'll save this as my diffuse image. So I'll go to File, and then I'll do a Save As. And let me create a new folder for this one. This would be stone. Call this. This is going to be a JPEG. And it's going to be stone wall. And then I'll add underscore DIFF for diffuse because it's the color version. So I'll click Save. And I'll say OK. Then I need to create the bump map, which is the one with all the texture. It's the rock itself. That's pretty easy. You're just going to create a high contrast black and white layer. So I'll go to New Adjustment Layer. We'll do the channel mixer. And I'll turn this to monochrome so that we have black and white, which makes it black and white. But then I might also need a levels adjustment. And we'll make sure that we have a nice bright white somewhere. And we have a nice deep black somewhere. So it's probably about there. So it's a high contrast black and white image. I'll then save this version. I'll go to Save As. Once again, it'll be a JPEG. And this is going to be the stone wall bump. And I'll go ahead and save. Now when we get to the displacement map, we've got some deep grooves that are the black areas, but the white areas or the faces of the stones are all out a little bit. But there's also a lot of stones. So I can do this in a variety of ways. One, I could go in and I could actually select each individual stone. So I could come in here with maybe the quick selection tool, and I could start selecting the faces of each stone, and I could work through not selecting the blacks, giving myself these grooves, and then I'm painting these in white and leaving the cracks in black. To make my life a little bit easier, though, I think I'm just going to work with the same levels here, but this time I'm going to increase the black, and I'll blow out the white so that I end up with a even more high contrast black and white to create those steps for myself. And we'll call this one the displacement map. So let me go to Save As. Once again, it's going to be JPEG. And this one is displacement. So DISP for displacement. Click Save. Once I have all of those saved, then I can go back to Rhino, back to this materials file. I'll click on my materials. We'll right click and I'll say Create Material Standard. We'll call this Stone Wall. I'll go ahead and say OK. Under the stone wall material, first thing we need to do is load up the diffuse. So I'll click on the lowercase m, and I'll go to Tex Bitmap. And this I saved in my demonstrations folder for today. What did I call it? How come I can't see it? Oh, it's new folder. Thank you. That's right. And of course, nothing's showing for me, right? Let me double check. Oh, it is under downloads. Clearly, I'm not making any sense today. Everybody has those days, right? So let's try that one more time. And it was in downloads. There it is. OK. So the first one is going to be the diffuse map. And I'll go ahead and say open. If I preview it, there it is. And if I preview it here, there it is. Then I'll come down, and the next one was going to be the bump map. So I'll check the box for bump map. I'll click on the M, Tex Bitmap, and I'm going to load up the bump map. And I'll say OK. And we should get a little bit of texture on the surface there. Remember, I might have to increase this value. This really might be more like 3. Then I'm going to increase the displacement map. We'll click on the M, and I'm going to go ahead and load up the displacement map. There it is. And I'll say OK. And on this one, my value here is going to be how much from the deep cracks. So in this kind of a stone wall, there's a pretty big jump. So maybe I'll do 1.5 on that. And we'll preview, and we should see them pop out just a little bit like that. That's good. And then let's go ahead and apply that stone wall to the material test layer. And then we'll go ahead and render it and have a look. So again, I didn't spend that much time doing the clone stamp, so I'd have a lot of seams that would show out when I actually put this together. You can see how much higher this is because of the displacement that I set up in it. So in the wall itself, you can see where the grooves are, and it's starting to feel like that wall. Something's up with the texture mapping on top. It's not applying correctly and it doesn't look right. So I'm going to have to spend a little bit more time sorting through that. The bark didn't look right either, so I must have messed up the texture mapping on the top of that box. So I'll go back and fix it. But essentially, this is how you go about creating a material from scratch, completely from scratch. And if you spend enough time in Photoshop, you can create virtually anything. The only other factors in creating these materials is you want to think about reflection. You know, a stone wall isn't going to have any reflection unless it's wet, in which case you might need some reflection. So occasionally you might need some reflection. The same process is there if you're going to create something with some transparency. If you're going to create a mesh or something, you just have to do the black and white that represents the mesh to create the cutouts. So I'm going to let you guys go and work on this. I'd like for you to shoot for about 4 materials. I think that's what I asked for. If you create your own material from scratch, I recognize that that takes an awful lot longer than creating one where you get it online somewhere and reassemble it for somebody else to use. If you create it from scratch, I'll be far more lenient. If you only post 1 or 2, that's OK, because you took your time and you created a good one. If you're borrowing them from some other website, then maybe you should do a few more. Does that make sense? OK, so take your time. Hopefully, you'll all be able to create one from scratch, because you'll learn a lot in that process and how it goes together. When obviously you'll save your final version of your sample file. You'll pack your file. When you upload them, you will upload them into your post, and just like you've done previously with your blocks, on the right side, you'll look for the V-Ray material category, and make sure you classify your V-Ray material as best you can. If you need to add some to that list, you can add a new term. That will help other users find it. There are lots of V-Ray materials that are on the website. If you go into your resources and you go to the V-Ray materials library, there's lots of categorized materials. So you could go into wall materials, for example, and it's a variety of materials that other people have done in the past. Anything with the Digital Tools logo on it, chances are I did it, so it's probably a decent material. It's also probably included in your material package. If you keep going in here, you may be able to find some others. There is an index that lets you go through and see a variety of other materials that are out there. You can, of course, download and use any of these materials that you might want. That's the point. Are there any questions? No? All right.